evening, everyone, and welcome to our Freedom School series for tonight, where we are featuring Dr. Periloux Peay, who is a political scientist at Georgia State University in the Department of Political Science, and he will discuss concurrent pressures of mass protests, the dual influences of Black Lives Matter on state level policy adoption. As we do every week, I want to thank you all for joining us, and we definitely want to thank Mr. Morris Gardner at Auburn Avenue Research Library for continuing to collaborate with the Department of Africana Studies at Georgia State University. In this Freedom School series, again, this is something that we have been doing for the last 3 semesters and that we will be continuing in the spring, where we bring relevant lectures to the Atlanta community and to our national community through Facebook Live and through Auburn Avenue's Research Library to discuss issues that are relevant to the Black community and topics that are relevant to the Black community. And I hope my internet is stable because I just received a notification that it was not. So if you cannot hear me, Dr. PA, please let me know. But without further ado, I'm going to introduce Dr. PA, our guest lecturer for tonight. So Dr. PA is currently an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at Georgia State University. His research examines how those from underrepresented communities employ collective strategies to shape political processes and outcomes from within and outside political institutions in America. His broader research question results in two distinct yet complementary branches of research. On one hand, he looks to update a surprisingly scant scholarly account of the most influential collective of Black representatives, the Congressional Black Caucus. He examines how underlying forces like institutional and interpersonal marginalization, intra-party issue avoidance, tokenism, and a denial to vital policy information have long constrained Black lawmakers' ability to achieve substantive gains in Black interest areas. The second line of research examines the impetus, implications, and effectiveness of racial protests in modern America, of which he is teaching a class next semester as well. Dr. PA examines the electoral and policy ramifications of the Black Lives Matter movement. He also studies state responsiveness and state-sponsored repression of the movement. His research can be found in the Journal of Race, Ethnicity, and Politics, Social Science Quarterly, and a National Review of Black Politics. Welcome, 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 Dr. PA. You're muted.
Yes, always do that. Thank you so much for having me, and thank everybody that decided to jump on today or will be watching this in the future, and it is a pleasure to be here with you all. I guess I have the floor at this point.
Yes.
All right. So thank you again for that wonderful introduction, Dr. Bonnet Bailey. As she mentioned previously, my research focuses on those questions of how marginalized groups use collective action to shape and achieve their policy goals, right? And as she mentioned, my research focuses on one end on the Congressional Black Caucus and how representation goes about from more of a collective perspective. My paper for today is birthed out of the second arm of my research, which looks at collective action by Black folk through the means of protests. And ultimately, the types of theories that guide my research throughout my time as a scholar are rooted in three large things: agenda setting, coalition building, and the focus of this paper today, policy diffusion. So with that, the impetus of this paper came from an early critique of the Black Lives Matter movement. This shouldn't be unfamiliar to anybody that paid attention from 2014 on. There were always questions about if Black Lives Matter was effective. Did it lead to substantive policy change? And for much of the movement's existence, people have been skeptical about that, right? critiques came both from media, from political scientists, from politicians, and even questions from within the movement or the movements. And this question guides this research topic that we're going to talk about today. So I'm looking at what role Black Lives Matter protests played in shaping police reform at the state level. All right. And we'll talk about why I'm focusing on state level politics in a little bit. But before we do, I want to present some of my lines of thinking, some of my hypotheses as to why I feel Black Lives Matter should increase the number of police reforms adopted at the state level. So on one hand, there might be some direct pressures that amount from protests, right? We know that protests shape media agendas, and if we've paid any type of attention from on the Black Lives Matter movement, from the moment that Michael Brown was shot in the streets and the video first went out on Twitter, the media has been engulfed with Black Lives Matter. This is partially because they are trained in a way to focus on protests. They're also trained to focus on conflict within protests and highlight tensions between those who are protesting and those who respond to protests. And in this instance, the state responded directly to these protests with an unfortunate show of force and repression, right? And the media gravitated towards that. The first images that many of us have of the Black Lives Movement were people in Ferguson, Missouri, being repressed by militarized police from all over the state of Missouri. Tear gas flying in the streets, LRAD machines, water hoses, the worst parts of Black Lives Matter movement. And that was a continuous theme for the first few weeks of the movement. And it resurfaced periodically throughout the movement as well. Well, the media pays a lot of attention to that, and politicians are keen to pay attention to the media. So we can argue that as the media's message changed on Black Lives Matter to one that focused almost entirely on the violence that was imposed upon the protesters, to the peaceful protests that 95% of Black Lives Matter protests were peaceful, as the message changed, so too might the response from government, right? And Omar Wasal's paper, a 2020 article, I believe, shows that peaceful protests can lead to agenda change. And this is one way that we would expect there to be some type of direct effects over time as the media response to the protest becomes more positive. The second thing that we know is that that protests shape public opinion, and we know that the opinion of Black Lives Matter over time has become increasingly in favor of the movement and the demands of the movement. Right? There might have been public skepticism towards Black Lives Matter early on, but we can trace the increase of support amongst the general public and the number of protesters and the diversity of protesters in support of the Black Lives Matter movement. So we could expect, if government is supposed to be responsive to the will of the people, which they're supposed to be, but I'm still skeptical of that, you can expect that there might be some type of policy change that might happen out of that shift in public opinion. And Daniel Gillian finds support that, the general public, as the general public's opinion sways, so too does the actions of the government. And then finally, we know that protests shape legislative agendas. We know that Black Lives Matter put a lot of pressure directly on politicians to actually do something, right? And the first response from state and local officials, again, was repression, but those demands, those behaviors started to change as the protests carried on throughout the last 6 years. And Daniel Gillian also has work that shows that as the strength of the protest and the message of the protest become more effective and larger, that the legislative agendas change, right? We can see this from the most recent round of Black Lives Matter protests, when you had Nancy Pelosi and other politicians kneeling, wearing kente cloths in the middle of Congress. We know that Congress and politicians pay attention to protests as they carry on. So from the first hypothesis that I propose is that states with more Black Lives Matter protests within their borders might be more responsive and more likely to have more reformative policing policies, these direct pressures from the protests within their borders. At the same time, there's a reason to expect that there are what we call diffusion effects or indirect effects, because policy isn't made in a vacuum, right? And policy diffusion is this idea that states take cues from one another to determine what their course of action should be. Berry and Berry in 1999 argue, certainly once a policy is adopted by one state, it is extremely unlikely that another state's adoption would be completely independent from the previous one. Unless two states arrived at the very same or very similar policies via a highly improbable coincidence. At a very minimum, there must have been some diffusion from one state to another of at least the idea of the policy. So this again leads us to believe that states are always watching one another to figure out what they should do based on what previous states' adoptions have accomplished. And with protests and the cries for policy change to reform policing, we can suspect that there are some ways that this could happen, right? Scholars that study policy diffusion understand that these are often made with a few considerations in mind. Like some states mimic other states that are have regional similarities to them. So like southern states like to pass similar laws to one another. Another line of thinking within policy diffusion argues that states will enact similar policies to those that have other characteristics that are similar to them. Like conservative states will adopt policies that other conservative states adopt. If we think about the things like critical race theory and voter suppression, these are definitely policies that spread through ideological similarity, right, at the state level. And then there's another line of thinking that says it's not necessarily the fact that there are similarities in characteristics, but there are just some states that are more innovative and then others follow suit naturally. It's called this leader-laggard model of policy diffusion, where some state is good at something and everybody else wants to be that state. So they will adopt similar policies to them to look like them, right? So what I expect to find with protest and police reform is that these protests became a catalyst for policy diffusion. It is likely that states took cues from one another to solve one of two problems. The first might be the actual problem of the protests themselves, and this is highly likely. We know that these protests spread throughout the country. Almost every state in the country had a protest, a Black Lives Matter protest within that first year. And these protests became problematic for the states for various reasons, right? So the problem that they might have been trying to solve might have been a way to tap down or quell the protests and solve that issue. The other problem might actually be the problem of police shooting. Maybe they took these protests to heart and actually wanted to solve the problem of police shooting. So they looked to other states to see how they were implementing reforms in an effort to stop police shootings. Well, either way, I expect there to be some type of diffusion effects where states will follow the lead of another state in adopting a policy in an effort to solve one of these two problems. Now, what I'm arguing in this work is that these two things don't have to be mutually exclusive. There might be a world where both of these pressures are happening, because at the end of the day, there might need to be dual pressures on states to actually move the needle. So my third hypothesis is that the number of policies enacted by a state can be dependent on both the direct pressures from media agenda change, from public opinion, from agenda change in the legislatures, but also as states are watching other people or other states adopt policies, these two things might be happening simultaneously, and that combination of those dual pressures will increase the number of policies that a state adopts. So we're looking at these policies from at a state level for a number of reasons. The first is that the American policing system is fragmented and convoluted. There are always disjointed and overlapping jurisdictions that are in play. We often think of police reform as a product of local decision making. So the police that we interact with most are police where we're housed in their jurisdiction. I'm from the Houston area, and I could live in one place and be in 5 different policing jurisdictions at the city level, at the county level, at a precinct level, and at a state level. I would have 4 different police jurisdictions or 5 different police jurisdictions that would respond to any given thing. So if a house got broken into, they would have to jostle over who would be the one to respond. Well, this becomes problematic when trying to trace police reform, because now you have to wonder what reforms are being attributed to who. But at the state level, we know that states will sometimes implement top-down mandates and incentives to try to curb police actions, right? This is similar to most other types of policies where states can say, we will give you money to do X if you do X. And if you don't do X, we will take the money from you, or we won't give you the money. So looking at a state level mandate is an interesting way of looking at it, because states typically resist interfering with police for a number of reasons. First, it's not politically advantageous to states to impose mandates on police. But so if they do, that means that there's some force that is pushing them to do so, right? But also they like leaving policing to themselves because it is such a fragmented occupation, right? Where there are multiple layers that you would have to impose these mandates on. So states typically lean back and don't try to impose their will on states. But again, if they do, then that shows you that there was such a tremendous push, some type of force that is motivating them to make these changes. So I want to take a look at one of the more recent states that adopted criminal justice reform. In January, long after the initial startup of the Black Lives Matter movement, and well after the George Floyd killing in the summer of 2020, we saw Illinois approve sweeping criminal justice overhaul. It ended cash bail. It also required cops to wear body cameras, which is interesting because body cameras aren't a new idea, especially in 2021. By 2021, most police departments were wearing body cameras, but Illinois was late to the party in requiring their cops to wear body cameras. And they did a few other things. But even now, states are still reforming policing. And we're going to try to figure out how it happens, why there might be a lag in the response time between when Black Lives Matter happened and what that means for police reform. In order to do that, I'm taking a look at police reforms adopted since the start of the Black Lives Matter movement, from August 9th, 2014, the day that Michael Brown was shot and killed, to December of 2020. And the source of this data is the National Conference on State Legislatures. They house a number of policy areas where they track data, track law enactments in a very detailed fashion. And we could talk about that if you have any questions over what the data actually looks like. If we look at policies in 3 specific areas: body cameras, use of force, and contact, you can see that a majority of the states passed some type of law, right? If we talk about body cameras, I'm looking at 3 specific areas. First is usage and funding, like mandating, like Illinois did, mandating that cops wear body cameras and providing them funds to do so. The research in this instance is conducting research to see if body cameras work in curbing police behaviors. And then finally, the public record is a way of mandating that if there is a police shooting, that the footage of that police shooting isn't withheld from the public, and that it's made available if there is a police shooting. Now, we have seen that many of police jurisdictions wear body cameras. This isn't the most stringent infringement on police behaviors. Now, the next category, the use of force, is much more restrictive on police actions. And you still have 27 states that enacted at least one of these four categories of trying to reform the use of force. 12 states actually passed laws defining or redefining police use of force, saying what's acceptable, what's not acceptable. Like, for example, New York State banned chokeholds, and other states as well. But 12 states passed policies to cut back on the use of force by defining or being more explicit about what is considered excessive force. 14 states actually made it easier to prosecute and investigate uses of force by police officers. And this poses a huge threat to the culture of policing. When you empower the district attorneys or state officials to actually go after people that use excessive force. This is actually substantive reform, right? Also, 14 states required states to, 14 states passed policies that required mandatory reporting and oversight over use of force, where previously there wasn't a coherent policy on how frequently they should report uses of force, who they report them to, how you collect the data. These 14 states passed laws that mandated reporting and oversight for each use of force by police departments in the state. And then finally, 10 states passed laws that made police officers take training on the use of force. This includes actual use of force training, diversity training, and like sensitivity and reaction training. So 27 states passed laws on use of force. Another 26 states passed laws that to curb the contact between police and citizens, to reduce that level of contact, in hopes that reducing contact between police and citizens will reduce the number of extrajudicial police killings. This includes citations in lieu of arrest. What that means is if somebody is caught with weed, they will get a ticket as opposed to being arrested, or decriminalizing drug usage in states. This is also done in hopes that it will, like, again, limit the contact between police and the likelihood that things escalate. The 10 states enacted policies to assign somebody else to respond to mental illness or mental crises, because many of the people who are killed by police are actually going through a mental health crisis and need somebody who is trained to diffuse those crises, as opposed to having a police response. So 10 states actually made it to where it's not the police responding to mental health crises, but it's somebody else. There are 7 states that created community policing programs. 3 states passed laws to limit the use or limit access to school resource officers. If we remember, there was a video not that long ago of a young woman in her desk, a young child in her desk being body slammed by a police officer, and that caused a lot of outrage. And there are states that have tried to limit the use of school resource officers. And then finally, 4 states have passed laws banning racial false 911 calls. And we're all familiar with that. We're like the woman in Central Park who called the police on a bird watcher, Barbecue Becky. All of these false 911 calls, the 2 gentlemen that were in a Starbucks that were business owners, that the Starbucks called the police and had them arrested. There are 4 states that actually criminalized that behavior between 2014 and 2020. And if we look at the distribution of how many states enacted X number of policies, right? 10 states enacted no policies, but 40 states passed at least one, and 32 of those 40 passed multiple reforms. This is actually incorrect. This is California, way out here in that passed 9 policies, but on average, across the 50 states, there was an average of 2.5 laws passed on average. So it's not just one state doing this or one state doing that. Most states enacted multiple policies to reform policing. Now, the key independent variable or the key factor in this that I think is influencing the likelihood of, or the number of policies that are enacted are the number of Black Lives Matter protests in the initial wave. I'm looking specifically at the initial wave, and that was between August 9th and August 9th, 2014 and August 9th, 2015, the 1-year anniversary. And Williamson et al. In 2018 cataloged all of these protests. Now, again, this was before the George Floyd wave of protests and in the summer of 2020. But this database actually categorized all of the most of the in-person protests, and they also verified each one of them via their media accounts. Now, there are some limitations to this data set, this database. They only included protests in cities with more than 1,000 people. That is definitely one limitation. But so it might be an underestimation of how many protests there were, but it's across the board. It's unified. It's uniform in their underestimation. If we look at where these protests were largely held, it's no surprise which 3 states were the hot spots, right? Missouri in the middle, of course. We know that Ferguson protested night in and night out for much of that first year. But you also had states like California and New York. If we think about Eric Gray and Akai Gurley, they had very Eric Garner, my apologies, and Akai Gurley. You had days upon days of protests in New York State and California as well. California is where the Black Lives Matter organization is housed, and they were really active in the state of California. But you also see states that had very notorious, infamous killings: Sandra Bland in Texas, Crawford and Tamir Rice in Ohio, Laquan McDonald in Chicago. All of these places with an unfortunate name association, they were hotspots of protests, right? And what I'm arguing is that states that had more protests would be more likely to both pass more laws as a result of that direct pressure, but also influence other states to pass particular laws. I also account in my modeling the different legislative ideologies. So with an expectation that liberal states will be more likely to enact policies. I also account for legislative diversity. So the states that are more diverse will have lower percentages of white lawmakers. I also think that the state political culture would impact their likelihood to adopt policies or the number of policies that they might adopt. And I measure that using the Obama 2012 vote share. So again, Black Lives Matter, the movement that we know as Black Lives Matter started with the killing of Michael Brown in 2014. So the 2012 presidential election is the closest one to it. So I'm using that election to try to shed light or try to tap into the general sentiments in a particular state. And then it might be that states with higher Black populations would be more likely to pass laws as well. I also account for gubernatorial control. Either a state is Democrat, trending Republican, or Republican. And then I also account for the state union culture. by a percentage of union membership, thinking that states that have stronger police unions might be less likely to enact laws. So again, my first hypothesis looks at the direct effect, and I use Poisson modeling, and we can talk about what that is in a little bit, for count variables. I also use a unique method called social network analysis to test hypothesis two. It is a way of tracing processes moving from one node to another or one state to another. And then I use what's called a linear network autocorrelation model to test for those concurrent effects. So my first hypothesis is that states that have more protests will enact more reforms. It's a straight up direct test. And we find in the model that that is significant. What it equates to is for every 20 protests, a new law is passed, right? So if a state had 80 protests, they're expected to pass on average about 6.5 laws or 6 to 7 laws, right? States that had 40 will pass on average 4 laws, and states that had none on average passed 1.5 to 2, right? So every 20 equates to a new law. So this would lead me to support the idea that there are some type of direct pressures that are at play, right? So who are the reformists according to those direct pressures? States, of course, with the most protests. Again, your more liberal legislatures will enact more laws, and your more diverse legislatures will also enact more laws. So states with lower proportions or percentages of white lawmakers will enact more laws. If we turn back to the Illinois article that I talked about earlier, where they recently in January passed reforms, we see some of this play out, right? We see that the Black Caucus played a huge role in impacting their likelihood of passing laws, or their likelihood of passing laws in January. We also know that these states saw an increase as they achieved power in the state, right? So the second hypothesis is that states that have more protests will be more influential in the spread of reform. States like California or Ferguson, or I'm sorry, Missouri or New York would be more likely to influence which laws other states pass than states that had fewer protests like Idaho or Wyoming, right? And to measure this, I use that social network analysis to trace which states are influencing which ones. And I do this using what's called a network inference package, and it takes 3 things into consideration. The first thing is it looks at all of the different adoptions, and it tests how frequently one state I, adopts before state J. So if Texas adopts a law 5 times before Florida was, it would say that this state is likely to influence another. But it doesn't just stop there. It looks at the length of time between state I or Texas adoption and state J, Florida hypothetically, and says if there's a short period of time between I and J, then there's a greater likelihood that state I influenced state J's adoption, right? And then they also look third at the precision by which state I adopts and state J adopts. So if there's ever a time that Florida adopts before Texas, then it will discount that likelihood that there is an influence between a particular state. So it looks at all 3 of those things in conjunction. And what it does, it looks at it across all of the different policies that I talked about. And this is going to be a mess for you to look at, but this is what it does under the hood, right? It looks at each one of these different policy areas along the timeline and says, and counts how many times state A did before state B and across how many issues those patterns took place. And what it does from there is it creates a network. It creates relationships between particular states, right? So this is what this network looks like at a broader level. And each one of these states are sized based on the number of states that they have influenced, right? So right off the bat, you see that California influenced a number of states, right? Utah as well, Texas as well, Maryland as well, and Colorado. Those are your biggest influencers. So what I wanted to test was what does the number of protests within a particular state say on their likelihood of influencing another state, right? Again, that's the hypothesis. So what I found, this positive number here that I've highlighted with the asterisks on side of it, suggests that that relationship is positive. So the more protests that you have, the more likely you are to influence another state's policy adoption, right? So with each protest, it increases the percentage by about 1.5%, right? So who are the influencers? The most influential states in police reform after Black Lives Matter, again, are your liberal state legislatures. So states that are more liberal, states with fewer Black citizens, which surprised me, but we can talk about why I think that is in a second. States with Democratic or trending Democrat executives or governors. States with weaker police unions are more likely to influence other states' policies, and diverse state legislatures, so states with fewer white lawmakers. The first one makes sense, right? More liberal states will enact more or will influence more laws. The second one is weird because you would expect states that have higher Black populations or that might have more political power to be more likely to influence state laws. But if you think about where Black citizens are concentrated, they're typically concentrated in states with Republican governors, right? And Republican legislatures, i.e. Georgia, i.e. Mississippi, i.e. Alabama. Your highest concentrations of minority people are in conservative states. So the likelihood of them actually responding decreases because of the politics in the state and their desire to not be responsive to those. Tack on the history of oppression that is often faced in states like this. It makes sense why your states like Utah might be more likely to enact policies that reform policing than a state like Alabama, because Utah can do so and not have to worry about what it looks like politically, because quite frankly, they don't have Black people to worry about, right? And reforming policing can look as if they're doing something for the demographics that live there as opposed to responding to Black Lives Matter protesters, right? So those are just a few things to think about. In the beginning, I talked about the different lines of thinking of how diffusion happens, and that one way is that regional similarity comes into play. Well, we don't find that. I don't find that in this paper, right? I don't find that Southern states are only sharing policies with other Southern states, or states in the West or the Northeast are only sharing with other ones. Contiguity, like sharing a border, doesn't matter either. And I don't find any evidence that states will mimic other states that look like them. So what that really means is that liberal states can share policies with non-liberal states. What I find the most support for is this idea, that leader-laggard model, where those pioneer states are the ones that are taking the lead and other states are following. So if we take a look back at that network, remember, California, Utah, Texas, and Maryland were the big influencers of policy, right? And this makes a bit of sense when we think about who the policy leaders are. Bumke and Desmarais, a couple of guys that I'm really good friends with, they looked at who's influencing policy over time, right? And what we find is that California, Colorado, and Utah are all in the top 15 of policy influencers across all policy areas over time, right? California is the #1 influencer of policy from state to state across all policy areas, right? Colorado's 13 and Utah's 15. Since 1995, California has been the leader in criminal justice reform, and Colorado is right behind them at #4 out of 50, right? And then Utah is actually #2, and Colorado is #3 in civil rights policy. So where this didn't make a lot of sense before, we know that these states, California, Colorado, Utah, these are states that are traditionally the innovators and leaders in creating new policies that other states will take a hold of. And we also see here that it's not states that are just that share ideology. So if you look at California, yes, we can say Massachusetts might have a similar ideology or Oregon might have a similar ideology, but we can't say that about Kentucky and Iowa, states that are also sharing policies or that are influenced by California. The same can be said about Utah. New Hampshire and Vermont and Nevada don't have similar political cultures or similar demographic makeups as Utah. Well, I mean, Vermont and Utah do, but Utah and Nevada certainly don't, right? So there's something else happening here, and it looks like it's this leader-laggard model of influence. The last thing that I want to test is the likelihood of those concurrent effects, the dual pressures that I talk about in the beginning, right? And again, I test this using that linear network autocorrelation model, and it allows for testing the direct effects that I tested first, as well as that network effect, that peer influence model. They're both incorporated into the same model. So I turn back to the table that I had. Remember that positive and we call it statistically significant result of the direct effects. We also find that peer influence also matters, right? So you're seeing both of these playing a positive role in the likelihood or the number of reforms that take place. We see that protests increase the number of policies, and protest influences the likelihood, increases the likelihood of a state being an influencer. And then that likelihood of being an influencer also increases the number of reforms that a state passes. So this leads me to support that concurrent pressure hypotheses that I proposed earlier. So there's a few takeaways that I want to talk about and future questions that we can look at, right? The very first takeaway is, quite frankly, it pushed to rest many of those claims that protests didn't lead to substantive policy change. If we're looking at the state level, we're able to identify not just one pathway of influence, but two that are happening simultaneously, right? There's also the takeaway that state level's policy responses to Black Lives Matter, again, appear to be shaped by those two factors. The intensity of the protests within their borders, and they're also keeping that eye on other states to see how they're responding as well, which makes sense now. Of course, several states were resistant to both that internal pressure as well as the peer influence pressures. Right? Of course, conservative states and states with Republican executives dug their heels in and were less likely to pass the similar laws. So this brings to light a few questions, right? Does this same concurrent pressure play out at a more local level, at the county or city level? If one city adopts a policy, does it put pressure on other cities to adopt policies? And are cities with more protests more likely to enact those similar more laws, right? Also, what role does a state's history have on this likelihood of influence? What I don't capture in my model is their propensity towards racism and the likelihood that different political factors might prevent them or dissuade them from enacting police reform, right? This also asks broader questions about how marginalized groups can gain ground in those stubborn states. So if you are a Black or brown person in states that don't enact police reform, What avenues do you have to get that done? And this motivates future research for that. I also ask, how can marginalized groups enact more progressive policies? The policies that I looked at aren't the most radical ideas on how to reform policing, right? One thing that's noticeably missing in the number of policies that are enacted at a state level is the movement to defund police, right? So if that is ultimately your goal, will protests be a pathway to get that, or is something else needed, or other more liberal reform ideas? And then finally, how did the states respond to repress the protests themselves? Right, we know that protests spread from state to state. Did it would be helpful to trace how repression or the use of militarized police also spread from state to state. There are also more questions related more to my research, right? How are the behaviors of the state Black caucuses influenced by protests? We saw with Illinois that the state Black caucus had a huge role in shaping their police reform back in January. So was this the case if more diverse legislatures were more likely to pass more laws? Well, what role do these Black caucuses or these collectives of minority lawmakers have across all of the states, not just in Chicago? Second, how do local municipalities respond to state level police reform mandates? Do they take these mandates to reform their behaviors seriously, and do they implement them, or is there pushback from local municipalities? And then finally, the ultimate question is, do these reforms actually work in curbing the number of extrajudicial police killings? If Black Lives Matter will ultimately be seen as effective, the goal should not just be to encourage reforms, it should be for those reforms to lead to a decrease or an elimination in the killing of unarmed Black and brown people. So this question can be examined over time, and I hope to do that. So given that, I thank you for your time. I hope that you gained something from this, and I'm glad to have shared a little bit of my research with you. And I appreciate you being here, and I look forward to any questions or comments that you might have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. PA. That was fascinating. And I'm definitely fascinated by your social network analysis and have tons of questions for you, probably offline, political scientists to political scientists, about the results. And I mean, I think it's just, I think it adds so much more to the literature just to see those that network and how other states influenced other states and possibly lead into some of the reform in this policy. Again, I'd like to thank you for presenting your research today, and I have opened it. I am opening it up now for questions. So if you have any questions, please place those in the chat, or you can place them in the Q&A segment of your Zoom call. But to get us started, I do have a couple of questions for you. So
Yeah.
to get us started on this conversation. And so one of the things that I was definitely interested by was going back and looking at your, I think the slide was entitled, it was a map that you had was talking about where reformations have occurred. And so even to look at that one, it was one of your earlier slides where you
Would
show,
it be helpful if I pull it up?
yes, thank you. But you were showing where reformations have occurred in the last 6 years, and you identified some states as having more policy reform than others, with California, of course, being the darkest one and standing out on that map. And you had two different maps. One of them was about reformations. Yeah, this one. And yes, exactly. And then, but I noticed that there were some places where there was not many police reformations. So, and I think you kind of explained this somewhat towards the end of your talk about why there are differences, but could you talk more about why there?
Uh-oh, I think I lost a little bit of you.
Yeah, it looks like she froze up. I'm not
Oh
really
no.
sure. Yeah.
What I think I got the gist of what she was saying.
Okay.
I did.
You froze up a little bit, but I think I get the gist of what you were saying. There's a couple of reasons why you have particular states that don't have very many reforms, right? Particularly the Mountain Northwest. It's not a diverse area, right? There's not. First of all, you don't have Black folk. You have a lot of you have like high concentrations of Native populations, right? And if we think about North Dakota, South Dakota, they had the pipeline protests going on at the same time. So that's another line I think that would be really interesting to trace, is the protest on the pipeline and how that impacted police reforming at the state level. But in terms of pressure on states like Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming, and even West Virginia, right? There's not a lot of pressure for them to reform police because you don't have police killing large amounts of Black and brown people like you would in states like Texas that are notorious for it, or California or New York, right? You don't have those uses of force. The second thing is that other chart that you alluded to is that there weren't protests in most of those states, right? So not only do you not have concentrations of Black and brown folk, you don't have protests that are pushing for the change, which is why I think you get a lot of that you don't get the reforms, is because you don't have either of those pressures going on at the same time.
Great, thank you. I think a second question I had is that we noticed that there was a time lag. So the data you have for the protest was between 2014 and 2015, and then but you're
I lost you again. Oh, there you go. Okay, gotcha.
okay. So my question is, if you had more data for those years, that 6-year time span, do you think that there will be a direct correlation between the protests that occurred and reform, or do you think there'll still be this time lag of reform that's occurring?
I do, for a number of reasons. The most important reason is that the states that are the hot spots for the protests in 2014 through 2015 are still the states with the hot spots in 2020, right? If we think about the folks that Eric Garner were protesting, and Freddie Gray in Baltimore, and in New York, New York, Baltimore, Ferguson, California, those are still the places that you see a large amount of protests now. But I do expect that correlation to hold over time. It's just collecting that data is messy and hard, and there aren't very many people that are doing it well. So that is certainly one of the limitations to the data that I have right now.
Okay. Thank you. Sorry, someone just walked into my house. See, that's what we do with these Zoom calls. And my dog ran out the door, so he was trying to stop him. So very sorry about that.
It's the world we live in now, COVID, man.
So you closed with some of your overall points, and I think you definitely made some good points on your takeaway. So what do you think that this adds to the current discussion about defunding the police? What do you think that your research adds to that, and what are some valuable insights that people that are in this movement to defund the police should utilize from your research?
On one hand, it is that there are huge questions as if protests work, and I think this shows that protests work to some extent, right? And the more intense that the protests are within a state, the more likelihood that change will happen on one of two fronts, right? I do, for more extreme measures the protests will, and you're seeing it actually happen at the local level, right? Particularly in places where there were a lot of protests. So in like Minneapolis, for example, they reduced the police budget significantly. In places like Seattle, they reduced the city budget, the police budget significantly. In Austin, you also saw them take away from the police budget and reallocate it to homeless shelters. So at a local level, you might actually see more of this playing out than you are at the state level. Remember, states are hesitant to actually act, right? And defunding police likely won't happen at the state level. That's part of the reason why it's not included in this, because the states aren't going to do it at a large level. And plus, you would have to look at budgets to see if that's actually happening. But at a local level, you are more likely to see it, particularly as you increase minority representation in city councils and in the mayor's offices and city managers' offices, as you increase not just protests, but your voting turnout and things like that. The substantive change might be more likely to happen at a local level. Now, the question is, will you see some of that spread, which is what I alluded to in the later part of my talk? It might be that certain localities or municipalities might be hesitant to adopt, just as some states were hesitant to adopt. But it's not to say that it can't and won't happen. But my papers would say you have to keep the pressure on them, keep your foot on the necks. And that is one way of accomplishing some change. As I show here at the state level, that should, and in some instances, does translate to the local level.
Yeah, and with that, I mean, I think it's great that you point to the also the relationship between repression of protests and the results of reform that's happening on the state level. Because that's the one thing I was thinking is that some states, and even when you look at local levels, probably more than states, may be responding to the coverage that they're receiving over repression, and to have more policies that show that, hey, look, this is not us. And I know we look bad on TV, but we're doing these things to reform policies dealing with the police in our state.
And even if you look at what happened on January 6th, part of the reason why the Capitol Police didn't respond to the rioters that ran through the Capitol was because they received so much negative press on how they responded to Black Lives Matter. Now, there's another reason that's tied into that. Now, this is like an apples to oranges comparison, because the protesters that raided the Capitol weren't Black.
Yes.
and they weren't opposing the police. Now, but that does highlight the difference in coverage that the two, like, media was very readily pointing out there was a stark difference between how DC Metro Police, State Capitol, or Capital City Police responded to Black Lives Matter compared to how they responded to people that were trying to overthrow the government. So yeah, I do think that there is something to that.
All right, thank you. We have a question in the chat, and it says, Dr. Peay, how would you define mass protests? Of course, there are many ways to define this term, but how would you define it after going through this in your research journey?
I think this raises a couple of questions, right? The way that I define it is by the protests of, in this instance, every protest in my data has more than 100 people, and it is in person, right? But we know that there are more than just that way of defining protests. Mass protests could be mass boycott. It could be, we know through history, through the civil rights movement, about sit-ins, marches. It could be a number of things, right? Hunger strikes. I mean, there are tons and tons of like prisons right now that are going through hunger strikes because of how they're being treated during COVID. Mass protests could be any avenue of resistance against the status quo or against their current situation, right? And I think that the the way that I limit the way that I consider mass protest in mind for the sake of research. But I also know that this is not just the only way that people express themselves during Black Lives Matter. There are numbers of ways that people were able to do so. So that is a very interesting question that is very relevant to this study, but also it opens avenues to other studies as well that can tie in other methods of protest as well.
Okay, we have another question in the chat. Have any cities other than Camden, New Jersey, that you know of dissolved and then rehired their police officers? And if you are aware, did it work for Camden? And if so, would that work elsewhere?
Um, Completely dissolve, I'm not sure. Like I said, I mentioned a few that have significantly reduced the budgets of their police officers, um, and of their police departments, and it's showing. I've seen recent research that the number of police killings has declined in cities that have reduced their police forces. Now, of course, all of this is left to play out. Like there's a lot of time that needs to happen before we're able to identify if this is a true causal effect of saying these 10 cities reduced their policing budget and they saw an extended period of time where there were a decrease in number of police shootings. The funny thing is now, because of mask mandates, police are defunding themselves, right? You're seeing police officers across the country walk out of their jobs because they oppose COVID mandates, mask mandates, or vaccine mandates. So it'll be interesting to see how this plays out in places like New York City, where thousands have walked off the job. The Black Lives Matter might not need to defund police. Police might defund themselves. So we'll see how, and that might also have an impact on the number of extrajudicial killings of Black and brown folk.
And I think not just in reference to COVID vaccines, but some police departments that didn't feel supported, like what we saw some examples here in Atlanta where police were quitting their jobs or leaving their jobs because they didn't feel supported by the administration or the leadership in their towns as well. And so they're actually been vacating in for various reasons in the last couple of years.
Right. So this turnover in policing forces will be something that I will and other researchers will be paying attention to for the next decade, because the harms or benefits of that will take time to play out, and it'll take like we'll see what happened. It'll also muddy up a lot of the research because it'll be hard to attribute who's leaving because of what, if it's the defunding or if they defunded before the police quit or whatever. But it'll still be interesting to track over the next 5 to 10 years.
Yeah, I definitely think it'd be interesting to track. And I think this is such interesting and timely research. And so thank you so much for sharing your research with us tonight. Like I said, it is very timely, and I think it's something that will be relevant for years to come. So you have chosen a good topic to actually investigate at this time. And I think, like you showed it in your presentation, there are still so many more questions to answer about the relationship between behavior and policy impact. And so this is very, very important. Before I close out, are there any closing final comments or closing remarks that you would like to say at this time?
The big thing is stay engaged, right? We're in Atlanta right now. We have a mayoral election coming up in a matter of days, and we have elections coming up before we know it. Right, next year is a pivotal time, and it'll determine the direction of our state and of our city. So stay engaged, get registered to vote, find your resources, know who your people are, get everybody that you know to vote, turn out, stay engaged. If you're a marcher, keep marching. If you support certain organizations, support those organizations, and keep going. Those are the big things.
Yes. Well, thank you very much, and thank you for taking time at your very, very busy schedule to present to us tonight. In closing, I would like to again thank Auburn Avenue Research Library for continuing to collaborate with the Department of Africana Studies and hosting these Freedom School lectures. And as many of you asked in the chat, these lectures will be posted to Auburn Avenue's Research Library YouTube page. And the link for that, those sites for that YouTube page is in the chat as well. So if you want to go back and view any of this lecture or any of the previous Freedom School lectures, they are all located on the Auburn Avenue Research Library page. And they're also live streamed through Auburn Avenue Research Library Facebook, as well as Department of Africana Studies Facebook. As I say, every time we have these discussions, I would also like to thank the Department of Africana Studies for continuing to support. I have moderated the last 2 lectures, but our faculty is fully involved and lead many of these lectures, and they all participate and moderate some lectures, and they will continue to do so in the future. So thank you to all my colleagues in Africana Studies for your support and your continued involvement in the Freedom School series. And of course, to pay homage to the person who thought of this series and thought of this relationship and this community engagement with Dr. Jonathan Gales, who is the chair of the Department of Africana Studies. This is his idea, this is his baby. He's kind of gave it to me to orchestrate, but this is his idea, and it's a way that we continue to emphasize our mission of community engagement with the Atlanta community and the national community. So thank you for tuning in, and thank you for joining us, and you all have a good night. Thank you very much.